For a sport built around overtaking action and frantic manoeuvres, Formula One can be painfully static at times, and not just with the on-track action at the 700th street circuit of the season. The F1 pit lane has remained stubbornly stagnant for the best part of the last 15 years. Sure, Toro V-Carb Racing Bulls has suffered more identity crises than a Dostoevsky novel, and then there's the likes of Audi taking over pre-existing outfits. But in terms of brand spanking new teams, now that's somewhat of a rarity. When the lights go green at the 2026 Australian Grand Prix, Cadillac will become the first new team in a decade to start an F1 race, preceded by their twice-removed American cousins in Haas. And since 2011, that's been it. Back in the good old days before the hair on my head had begun the migration down to my chin, teams would come and go with alarming regularity. In the earliest days of the sport, just about anyone and everyone with a faint semblance on how to drive a car could just rock up with a chassis and an engine bought off the shelf, cobble it together and head out racing. There were single car entries, privateer efforts, local races, third cars for some of the bigger outfits, all swelling to the crescendo of the 1989 season, where you could find 20 different constructors up and down the pit lane. That remains F1's most jam-packed entry list, and in the years since, numbers have slowly dwindled to the point of barely more than half that bumper crop of 89, and the exodus of teams has far outstripped those coming in. F1 has instead become the world's biggest VIP members-only club, with an ever-increasing difficulty scale for obtaining membership, with new teams jumping through stringent hoop after stringent hoop to prove that they have the finances, resources and technical capabilities, forking out, as Cadillac have just done, over $450 million in anti-dilution fees before gaining the nod of approval from not just the FIA, but the existing teams, Liberty Media, and presumably anyone else who might wander into the boardroom whilst the discussions take place. Purists will say this exclusive nature goes against that everyone is welcome, let's all just go racing spirit of motorsport. Perhaps the truth, though, is that F1 had its fingers burnt the last time the doors were opened, and is understandably hesitant to make the same mistake twice. Back in 2010, you couldn't move for new entries. Talk about waiting ages for a bus, and then lo and behold, 4 came along at once. It was and remains F1's biggest influx of constructors for many, many years. For those making those first steps into the sport, the movers and shakers behind such operations held big dreams for their futures, as names like Frank Williams or Ron Dennis might have done when they too took those first tentative steps into Formula One. Yet for all the hopes and expectations each outfit would have had, retrospectively we can look back now and recall how this fantastic 4 was anything but. How each was doomed to fail, and the lingering question was when, not if, each would meet their demise. There were those who never stood a hope from the get-go, howdy USF1. Others looked primed for a lifetime of scrabbling, cap in hand, race to race, season to season, hola HRT. And others who had some of the right components but never the right ideas. Greetings to the CFD-designed too small fuel tank-wielding Virgin operation. But then there was the green and gold of Lotus. Soon it would morph into, not at all confusingly, a different kind of Lotus, and eventually it would settle upon the name of Caterham. Even if you couldn't trust the operation to keep the same branding over its motorhome for consecutive race weekends, it was still the one outfit that most channeled their hopes into. Whilst the initial gap between the well-funded established teams and these new budgeted rookie outfits proved to be one better measured by calendars than stopwatches, there was always a sense from the media, engineers and fans alike that if any of them were to close the gap and join the established midfield pack, it was the Caterham Lotus operation, and it wasn't hard to see why. Compared to clunky titles like USF1, This was a brand with heritage and with impetus. There were the right technical people to guide the project, people like Mike Gascoigne, who had worked wonders with the likes of Jordan and Toyota, and who many recognised as F1's best firefighting fixer. It had the backing of a CEO who bubbled with enthusiasm for the sport, one who would put his money where his mouth was. And unlike those other new arrivals, these cars would be hustled around the track not by baby-faced rookies plucked from the junior series with ample-sized wallets, but reputable veterans with ample experience in the big leagues. Whilst others merely dreamed of survival, closing the gulf of performance between themselves and the tail end of the midfield was just a minor goal for this team. Points were the minimum expectation by year 2. As for winning a race, quipped Gascoigne, we're looking at 3 to 5 years to get into that position. You might question if any of that came to be true within a video with the word catastrophe scrawled across the title, and, dear viewer, you're quite right to be sceptical. Just shy of 200 constructors have attempted to tackle F1 since the sport officially began at the 1950 British Grand Prix. Few can match Caterham for a project that was so overhyped, overambitious, and somehow staggeringly stagnant. Before anything else, we need to tumble back to 2009. Formula One was in the midst of the world's most gripping game of the hokey-cokey, with no one quite sure who was in or out. The ongoing global financial crisis had already seen Honda bid a swift sayonara from F1, and in an effort to prevent the series looking like the 2005 US Grand Prix on repeat, FIA President Max Mosley had proposed an optional €30 million budget cap for teams, with more technical and design freedom permitted to those who operated within those parameters. It went down as well as a balloon of the lead variety, with teams who grumbled it would only demote the sport into a 2-tier championship, and the vast majority of constructors, including Ferrari, Red Bull and Renault, promptly declared they'd be taking their ball and heading off to set up their own Grand Prix World Championship. Panicked, the FIA responded by opening entries to join the F1 field for 2010 to fill those potential gaps. The proposed budget cap offered the prospect of new teams being competitive from the get-go, and so the FIA's application centre swiftly turned into a replica of the Dursley's living room, with no fewer than 15 teams lodging an application for one of 3 grid vacancies on offer. Amongst the cacophony of interested parties was an outfit not known as a Caterham or a Lotus, but a Formula 3 operation by the name of Litespeed. If that's a name that doesn't ring even the faintest of bells, you're not alone in that respect, because few else at the time had either. Set up by a pair of former Lotus engineers in Nino Judge and Steve Kenchington, their racing record at this point in time read simply, failed to complete even a full season in the B-class category of British Formula 3. With their application going up against both giants of other racing categories like ProDrive, Epsilon Euskadi and Campos, plus reimaginings of F1 teams of yore like March and Brabham, Litespeed needed something to make them stand out from the crowd. Step 1 was securing the services of someone with a strong reputation when it came to car design, the aforementioned Mike Gascoigne. His name might not be as memorable as that of an Adrian Newey or a Ross Brawn, but it was one with a proven track record in F1. Having cut his teeth with Sauber and Tyrrell, the protege of the late Harvey Postlethwaite had become technical director of Jordan in 1998, and had taken them from pointless beginnings there to their most successful ever season 1 year later, finishing just shy in one of F1's most unlikely title challenges. Major manufacturers soon came knocking. He took Renault from the back of the field to the top step of the podium, before joining Toyota. Just 2 years into the sport, they were already well regarded as an outfit with a high expenditure, low results kind of program. But Gascoigne completely transformed their fortunes. In his first year, he quintupled their previous best points tally, not to mention delivering their first batch of pole positions and podiums. On the sidelines since departing from Force India at the end of 2008, the man nicknamed the Rottweiler was champing at the bit to get back into F1 and work his magic once more. That was a positive step towards a possible admission, but there was still more work to be done. Gascoigne was a fairly big name in F1 circles, but you know what was an even more eye-catching title? A little something I like to call one of the most famous names in F1 history. Say Lotus to a modern generation of F1 fan and they might just assume you're chatting about a new TV show or a delicious biscuity spread. They would not perhaps consider one of F1's most innovative, groundbreaking and successful teams of the past. Founded by one of the sport's great engineers in Colin Chapman, the team had introduced notions like front and rear wings, monocoque chassis and ground effect, pioneering the way forward to make F1 cars faster and faster. At the wheel of those cleverly concocted offerings were legendary names like Jim Clark, Emerson Fittipaldi and Mario Andretti, all of whom tasted championship success with Lotus. Gone from the F1 grid for 25 years, Litespeed recognised that here was a brand that fans, staff, sponsors and most importantly the FIA could get on board with, and set to work on securing the rights to a brand whose iconic logo, in the words of journalist Alan Henry, once rivaled Ferrari's prancing horse for sheer romantic allure. Now seems as good a time as any for us to take a quick diversion into a section I'd like to call Clarifications Corner. We can't really mention a brand like Lotus without delving into some of the logistical nightmares that came attached with that name, namely the fact that since 1954 there had been two Lotus? Lotai? Lotisois? Two brands called Lotus swirling about. This may seem an unnecessary tangent, but trust me when I say the divide between Lotus 1 and Lotus 2 has some rippling consequences on this tale. On one side you had Group Lotus, formerly Lotus Engineering, which dealt with the production of Lotus's road cars. After the passing of Chapman in '82, ownership bounced around various companies from General Motors to ex-Bucati chairman Romano Artioli, before winding up in the hands of Malaysian manufacturer Proton in 1996, where it remained since. This was the first Lotus that Litespeed approached, keen for not just the brand, but the contacts and resources of an automotive giant. Just before the British Grand Prix, they found themselves in contact with Malaysian businessman Tony Fernandes, whose Air Asia airline had sponsored Williams since 2007, and through his connections were able to enter discussions with Proton, who turned them down, leaving another Lotus-branded avenue to explore. This second Lotus was Team Lotus, essentially the operation that had run cars across junior categories, IndyCar, sports cars, and of course, Formula 1. Unlike Lotus Cars, this had remained under the control of the Chapman family up until the end of 1990, when two former Lotus employees in Peters, Wright and Collins took control of the reins. But with results dwindling and debts rapidly mounting, the Peter pairings sought the assistance of ex-racer turned businessman David Hunt, brother of former world champ James. Hunt represented a consortium looking to buy Lotus, but without the money ready to do so, leaving David forced to stump up the cash. "We were told if we bought it, certain things would happen and we'd be alright," said Hunt. "We did, and we weren't. We were left holding a large, expensive baby." Said baby was one with a toppling pile of breached contracts, no sponsorship, no drivers, and approximately 96 staff members. Very soon, despite a brief partnership of sorts with F1 backmarkers Pacific Grand Prix, staff were made redundant, the team went into administration, and all that was left of the once great outfit was a trademark on the name, left in the hands of Hunt. What had followed was a long-standing tussle between Proton seeking to unite the Lotus brands under one umbrella, and Hunt working hard to hold on to his baby and find a way to get it back into F1. When Litespeed sidled into David's DM seeking that big brand to secure their spot on the F1 grid, hey presto, Litespeed Team Lotus was born. But when the 2010 entry list was released on the 12th of June, speed would prove not to be the only thing the team were light on, when the FIA announced they had accepted just 3 entries: Campos Meta, latterly HRT, Manor Grand Prix, latterly Virgin, and a US F1. Far from being deterred, Gascoigne and co were encouraged to keep trucking along with their prospective plans. The war between Moseley and the team's association seemed far removed from any hopes of a ceasefire, and there were whispers that some of the sport's larger brands like Toyota and Renault could still be heading toward the exit. Those whispers proved right on the money. At the tail end of July, BMW announced they would bid Auf Wiedersehen from F1 at the year's end. Suddenly there was space at the top table once more, and those previously rejected options scrabbled to place themselves at the front of the queue to claim that now vacant 13th and final slot. Soon, two names were brought right to the forefront. Sauber hoping to buy back the team that BMW had previously bought off them, and new form Lotus. Litespeed and Hunt were no longer involved. In the interim time from that initial rejection, Fernandes had pushed forward with discussions with both Proton and the Malaysian government to cobble together an agreement to use the Lotus name, and had now done so successfully. What was officially called One Malaysia Racing Team was branded with the Lotus Racing moniker and had obtained Litespeed's entry package with Gascoigne and other resources in tow. Though Moseley supposedly preferred Sauber, on the 12th of September Lotus were finally given the green light. Fernandes spoke at length about his aims, firstly to revitalise the Lotus name and return to the front of the pack with the sport's top marks. The second, not a million miles from the aspirations of their competitors in North Carolina, was to make this a national affair. In his words, to show Malaysia has more to offer than constructing tall buildings. Plans were highlighted that down the line, Malaysians would be running, operating and driving the project, and ideas were put in place to expand future R&D and manufacturing at a facility right next door to the Sepang circuit that had housed an F1 Grand Prix since 1999. Malaysia already had a proud history within F1 at this point in time, and not just from their Grand Prix circuit. The Malaysian government had been major sponsors of Stewart Grand Prix back in 1997 and Minardi in 2002. The latter had been thanks to the efforts of Alex Young, who had become Malaysia's first and thus far only driver to compete at the highest level, though the word compete may be a little too complimentary when it comes to Alex's adventures. There was also the input of the state-owned oil and gas company Petronas, who had branded the Ferrari engines used by Sauber for the best part of a decade, and could now be found brandished across the new Mercedes team livery, jumping ship from the defunct BMW operation. A team with an impetus on creating a production line of Malaysian talent seemed the next logical step. A 5-year plan was laid out, with winning races seen as a realistic goal at the end of it. There is a plan, a vision, a dream, declared Fernandes. If you cast your minds back to the last time we discussed a lean, mean, green team, you might recall how before Ford bought out Stewart, their vice president Jacques Nasser once infamously looked out upon a sea of visiting tifosi at a Grand Prix and declared, "Next year, we will make this a sea of green." Fernandes had aspirations to match. Now if you go to the Malaysian Grand Prix, I see my people wearing Ferrari shirts. One day I want to see them wearing something Malaysian. As Nasser would attest though, competitive results would be a must to try and convert those tifosi faithful elsewhere. And there was a clear belief that those results would come. Though the previously mentioned budget cap would be swiftly discarded, Fernandes was confident that money wouldn't be an issue. Estimates of around £20 to £30 million to get the car on the grid were spouted, rising to £55 million once running costs were included. For comparison's sake, this was very much at the lower end of team budgets of the era, with the likes of Ferrari and McLaren spending well over £200 million apiece, and even the thriftiest teams like Force India running to a budget of approximately £80 million. But as Fernandes put it, it's not about money, but all about having the right people and being smart, as Force India have shown. Those right people consisted of just 4 bodies, Gascoigne included, when first arriving at Lotus's new headquarters, the Racing Technology Facility in Norfolk. So bare was both factory and workforce that one of Lotus's drivers reportedly found part of the team building walls and floors when they first arrived at the facility. But soon both the workspace and the team began to take shape. Through Gascoigne's MGI engineering company, a number of contractors were available with just a day's notice, and soon the design team swelled to 25. Wind tunnel specialists Aerolab plus parent company Fontech set to work on an aero program. Another big boon came when Toyota followed the example of BMW and bid a swift sayonara to F1. With a huge number of staff now available, a great majority defected across to Lotus. The race team were all former Toyota people, as was practically all the aero team too. Other resources were quickly snapped up, including a contract with engine suppliers Cosworth, the long-standing successful supplier, who'd also be shipping off V8s to the rest of the newly joined crop, plus Williams too. Attention now turned to the final piece of the puzzle. Who would occupy these brand new Lotus seats? Each of the new teams would take a different approach on this matter. For the likes of HRT and USF1, it was a matter of youth and sponsorship funding, and not necessarily in that order. Virgin opted for the classic blend of established driver and promising rookie, but for Lotus they recognised that, as any good gamer will tell you, when it comes to levelling up, experience is key. For 1C, as far as Gascoigne was concerned, there was only one option, and that was the Italian Jarno Trulli. The duo had worked together at Jordan, Renault and Toyota, and Gascoigne had seen enough in that time together to declare the former one-time race winner as one of the fastest F1 drivers over one lap. The one thing you always know is how quick the car can go at 3 PM on a Saturday, said Mike. With Trulli extracting the maximum on each occasion, it would give the team a fantastic baseline to understand where they were at. The other seats took a little longer to nail down. In line with Fernandes' Malaysian machinations, it was hoped that a homegrown talent might be found for the second seat, with the Proton-backed Fairuz Fauzi hotly tipped. Thankfully, common sense trumped passports on this occasion, and Fauzi was installed as test driver, with Alex Young tasked with heading an Asian driver search program for future vacancies. Alternate experienced candidates were mooted, including ex-champion Jacques Villeneuve and Japan's Takuma Sato, before the role went to Finn Heikki Kovalainen, another one-time race winner who had just recently been dropped from McLaren after having his butt systematically handed to him by Lewis Hamilton in their 2 years together. But even Gascoigne saw the positives from that, declaring he's got something to prove, he's fired up. Heikki declared Lotus as the best chance for me to be a world champion than in any other team, including McLaren. On the 12th of February, the team's first car, the T127, was unveiled in London. Fernandes declared that words cannot express how I feel today, before delivering a monologue expressing how he felt that day. Jokes aside, there was a clear reverence for the Lotus name his cars would be carrying. Fernandes spoke of how much it meant to receive the blessing of the Chapman family, how he recognised this opportunity would be stood on the shoulders of giants like Clark, Moss and Hill. We are honoured and cherished to be part of history, said Fernandes. We will leave no stone unturned in our efforts, and we will do our best to return Lotus to its glory days. That, though, was still quite a ways off. Given the late-minute notice of the team's acceptance, targets were set suitably low. Though Gascoigne, perhaps with a touch of sass, quipped that Lotus wanted to rival the debut of Brawn the previous year, the first goal would simply be getting the car onto the grid for the season opener in Barren. Thereafter, Trulli was quick to stress that progress would be coming slow and steady. We have to prove ourselves and to gain respect in the paddock. We have to establish ourselves as the best of the new teams and see what gap we have between us and the rest. Only then will we really understand what gains we need to make. Target number 1 was ticked off with ease. Exactly 6 months to the day they were first accepted, Fernandes and Gascoigne would proudly watch on as Kovalainen followed Trulli out onto the Sakhir circuit for Friday practice. Comparatively, the Virgin pair would manage just 10 laps that day. HRT did exactly 10 less than that, and USF1 didn't even show up at all. It can't be stated enough how, in half the time the Americans had, Lotus had put together 2 F1 cars, whilst their counterparts hadn't even finished a monocoque. It reflects as positively on Lotus as it does negatively on USF1, but hey, we've been down that road already. Though the version of Timo Glock would pip Trulli by a tenth to be head of the group in qualifying, come race day, Lotus had the last laugh. The other 4 new cars had retired by lap 17. Both Lotuses, meanwhile, were classified at race end, with Kovalainen 15th, whilst Trulli tactically retired at the final corner to allow the team to inspect his gearbox. "I don't think we could have done anything better," said Gascoigne, whilst Fernandes tweeted, "What an amazing day. Lotus is back." More early season promise would follow along. At their home event in Malaysia, both McLaren and Ferrari somehow concocted the scheme to fail to set bank laps in qualifying before the rain fell, meaning inexplicable Q1 exits for them and a surprise maiden Q2 appearance for Lotus with Kovalainen. 2 weeks later in China, after not electing to pit behind the safety car, the Finn then hit another milestone when he became the first of the new teams to run inside the points. Within the first 2 months of the season, Lotus had quickly established themselves as the best of this new rest, a position they would maintain for the entirety of the year. On 12 out of 19 occasions, Lotus were the first of the trio at the checkered flag, and Kovalainen was that secondary class winner 9 times, as the battered and bruised Finn found his reputation heading on the up. Results weren't limited to on-track performances, as in TV coverage stakes, Lotus again trumped the other 2, though largely assisted by their involvement in 2 of the year's more shocking moments that were hit on replay in every broadcast and season review. Terrifying as it was to see Mark Webber going airborne, it did frankly pale in scare factor when compared to seeing Virgin's Richard Branson in a flight attendant outfit, the aftermath of a bet between himself and Fernandes over whose team would finish ahead of the other in 2010. By the time you'd finished bleaching your eyes, though, you couldn't miss the fact that when discussing Lotus's debut/return, that it was one viewed through a prism of direct comparison to those other new teams, and rarely with any connection to the existing pack. To do so completely changes the reflection of the year, from awesome to almost atrocious. The simple point was this: once Mosley had scrapped the prospective budget cap, there was always an expectation that there would be a gap between the new teams operating under the anticipated budget and the old operating with vastly more pre-existing finances and resources. Lotus might have led this chasing pack, but they were regularly chasing down a gap of around 4 to 5 seconds to the pace of the frontrunners, and 2 seconds from those at the tail end of the midfield. The gap was so big, Lotus openly stopped development for the year from Silverstone onwards, as there was simply no point trying to surpass it. "We were still 1.5 seconds from the established teams," admitted Gascoigne. "We'd expected to be within half a second." The net result was that, even with points now being extended from the top 8 to the now established top 10 system, Lotus ended the year with a big old goose egg in the points column, with Kovalainen's 12th place finish in Japan being the best result from both them and their fellow new teams. We might have lauded it for being the B-tier version of the McLaren MP44, but in outright competitiveness, the T127 left a lot to be desired. Reliability was a big bugbear, with numerous issues relating to hydraulics and gearboxes, leading Trulli to lament, "I knew that it wouldn't be easy, but I had at least expected to drive." In Lotus's defence, as Gascoigne has said, "The bit we built has been reliable. You'd think our suppliers would know how to make these systems." I suppose that leads us nicely to the bit they built then. Given the team's priority was to A, get a car on the track, and B, make it go faster later, the T127 was about as conservative as David Cameron. And if you were to ask Kovalainen what was wrong with it, then you'd be recommended to sit down with a big bucket of popcorn whilst the Finn divulged all. The chassis design and efficiency is wrong, and the aero package is not optimised. The balance is not the biggest problem, but if you look at our straight line speed and the grip, the fundamentals aren't right. But again, that wasn't a symptom of a bad team or poor resources, just a lack of timing. "We operate like a real team in the top series," reflected Jarno, "but unfortunately we are only at 10% of our potential because of a lack of time." Imagine then, pondered the media, their potential with a full season's worth of work behind them. As Gascoigne was keen to stress, we had a huge task to get the team off the ground, but with the rules pretty stable for next year, we feel that there's an opportunity to level the playing field and we think we can be point scorers on a regular basis from next year. Sadly, we cannot end the discussion of their first year without a return to the thrilling world of Clarification's Corner. For despite all the positivity and optimism to be found over their year, much of the newspaper paragraphs would concern yet more prattling over the team's identity moving forward. As soon as the T's and I's had been crossed and dotted on their acceptance paperwork, a low rumble of grumbles had almost immediately emerged over the usage of the Lotus name. To some, it was like a phoenix rising from the ashes, as Henry quipped that he had hoped somewhere the spirit of Chapman was looking on approvingly. Others took a more negative perspective, such as an equally legendary figure in Murray Walker. He was one of many who felt this was more akin to Lotus being exhumed from its long-standing burial. New Lotus ain't Lotus, objected Murray, and sadly to me, it never will be. Happily for those naysayers, it seemed like it wouldn't be Lotus for that much longer. Throughout 2010, Fernandes and new Group Lotus CEO Danny Barha had grown increasingly estranged. Whilst the former of the two was establishing his own F1 venture, Barha seemingly had some Lotus-branded F1 ambitions of his own, seeking to join forces with Junior Series giants ART to snaffle up the remnants of the old Toyota team, with the former manufacturer's base and equipment remaining dormant for all of 2010. The fact that there was a Toyota-Lotus connection through the Japanese giant's supply of engines to the Lotus road models wasn't lost on those debating whether a deal for these old components could be put together. The two were heading in opposite directions, something formally confirmed when the Malaysian was informed his license to race under the Lotus Racing moniker would not be getting renewed, despite a 5-year deal to do so. Faced with the prospect of a rebrand with a name like Fernandes Grand Prix not exactly rolling off the tongue, help was sought from our old pal David Hunt, who was only too happy to put a deal together. Under the lights of the Singapore Grand Prix, Fernandes, Hunt, drivers and a variety of shareholders gathered to announce that Lotus would be rebranding into Lotus, specifically from Group Lotus to Team Lotus. Barha's Lotus, meanwhile, would join forces with Luxembourgish investors G9 Capital to create Lotus Renault GP, who would succeed their former Renault factory effort in 2011. The net result was firstly the head-scratchingly confusing sight of two separate Lotus-branded entities circulating about the next year. The second was a legal fallout, with a process as long and tedious as the director's cut to Ben-Hur, as several lawsuits swiftly sprouted, pertaining to squabbles over who could use the Lotus name, and of Proton's U-turn over licensing with Fernandes. Matters would rumble on until May 2011, when it was declared that everybody was entitled to race as the Lotus of their choice. Off-track sagas aside, things were looking particularly good for Team Lotus in 2011, as a bucket load of new resources, staff and upgrades rolled through the door. First were a few assorted bits and bobs from reigning champions Red Bull, courtesy of a deal to supply Lotus with gearboxes and hydraulic systems from 2011 onwards. Not long after, the old Cosworth engines were hurled into the nearest skip in favour of Renault, who'd be powering the green machines for the next 2 years. Not only did both deals hopefully nip the reliability issues of the previous year in the bud, but with such upgrades on core car components, more competitiveness was expected to follow. As Trulli quipped, "We have half a car that is a world champion car." The rest was up to Lotus to match that performance level and make the stride towards the midfield. That seemed achievable as several more bodies came through the door, a great number of which transferred across from aspirational midfield rivals Force India, including their new technical director Mark Smith. Despite the most generic name in the history of humankind, Smith did boast a solid CV, having formerly worked in the same role with Red Bull and Jordan. Stability came through retaining both Kovalainen and Trulli, whilst looks to the future were cast as Fernandes' Team Air Asia effort was accepted into the GP2 field, meaning there was now, theoretically at least, their own junior stairway to climb into F1. Moving forward, a large number of those who drove for the GP2 effort would end up testing for the F1 outfit at one point or another. With all that under consideration and the benefit of an adequate preparation period this time around, Chief Executive Riyad Azmat was found gesturing to his watch declaring, "It's points time," and targeted running with the likes of Toro Rosso and Sauber. Gascoigne was confident even beyond that. He'd considered the new T128 car a big step up and a contemporary design. Never mind those at the back of the midfield pack, the Rottweiler fancied having a crack at the other Lotus-labelled team by the end of 2011, an ambitious target given the average 2.5-second gap that had existed between the two of them in 2010. Consider all that hyperbole, and it would be hard to view Lotus's sophomore year as anything other than disappointing. The promise of points, the guarantee of gap closing, all fell flat, and once more, Lotus finished a pointless 10th in the Constructors. That's not to say a step forward wasn't made, but it was one more small step than it was one giant leap. If the previous year's car was the B-tier equivalent of an MP44, then 2011 was an RB19 in the unofficial secondary category. On 16 out of 19 occasions, they were the first of the trio home, and once again, it was Kovalainen leading the pack home more often than not. They were now holding the Virgins and HRTs at even more of an arm's length, but still within the no man's land between them and the tail of the midfield. But dig into the details and you can see some progress was made. On a select few occasions, around a third of the time, the difference between Lotus and the midfield could be measured by less than a half a second, rather than the many seconds it had been previously, or admittedly, was on other circuits. The biggest boost had come in Spain, their first Q2 appearance in dry conditions, thanks in part to issues striking both Nick Heidfeld and Rubens Barrichello, and then out-qualifying both Force Indias to secure 15th on the grid, albeit as both these cars had elected to sacrifice grid position in favour of saving an extra set of soft tyres for the race. The BBC's Eddie Jordan accused the team of playing too short a game for the sake of 5 seconds of fame. Kovalainen responded, "That's the boring approach." Little improvements would occasionally be happening in races too. In 2010, a Lotus beat one of the established entities on just 2 occasions. In 2011, it was becoming less of an uncommon experience. In round 3, China, Kovalainen beat the Williams of Pastor Maldonado and the Sauber of Sergio Perez home, and was in a car length of beating the Force India of Adrian Sutil too, following the German's last stop. The same would be achieved in Belgium and India, beating the other Williams of Barrichello, before Gascoigne's prophetic words came true at the tail end of the year, with Kovalainen beating one of the Lotus pair home in Singapore and then Brazil. I'll be the first to admit this is an attitude of us requiring a very swift manicure from how deeply we've been scraping the bottom of the barrel to find a positive. Thankfully, there was a clear understanding from Lotus on just why the planned progress hadn't been as seismic as hoped. The team had elected to run without Kurz in 2011, citing a lack of resources to properly develop it and questioning its benefit. As it turns out, those wielding the kinetic energy recovery system and the small power boost that came with it did enjoy a lap time advantage, around half a second a lap. It explained part of the deficit Lotus was enduring, but admittedly not all. For Gascoigne, it came down to the size of the project. We wanted to be racing at a midfielder level and didn't manage it. We're still new to it, still smaller than them, still putting it together. According to him, on an aerodynamic front, Lotus were only operating on 60% of the level of those they were chasing. That led to issues not just with their aero package, but troubleshooting the car's blown diffuser. Lotus had implemented one akin to those used at the end of 2010, only for other teams to take a massive step forward. This has been a problematic area, said Gascoigne. Simulating a blown diffuser is difficult, and getting it to work full size is equally difficult. To sum it up neatly, as he puts it, take that and a Kurz, and there's our deficit. In short, all Lotus needed was a little time. It might take a little longer to get to where they wanted to go, but they could still get there. Tentative steps had been made into the midfield in 3 of those final 6 races, potentially showing the signs of that gap gradually, nearly, almost closing. As Kovalainen pointed out, asking for that huge surge of performance within just 2 years was always going to be an unrealistic time frame. It took Red Bull over 6 years to make it, he noted. And that was of course coming from a pre-existing template from their time as Jaguar and Stewart, not an entirely new startup like Lotus had been. You could see then why Fernandes was happy to gaze towards 2012 with the same ambitions as the year before, now these technical issues were corrected. Towards the end of last year we were so close to the midfield cars, but our lack of cars limited our capabilities. In 2012, with the people and facilities we have in the factory and the wind tunnel, with cars, I am confident we will become a danger to many of the midfield teams. I want us to achieve a point somewhere in 2012, maybe 2 if we are very lucky. So it was that 2012 rolled around and the season previews and the journalist scribblings of the time all read much of the same way as they had done previously. They look the most complete of the 3 new ones. The ingredients are in place for a more competitive package. They looked poised to move forward. Even Kovalainen was found to say, "I think the chances are better than in previous years." Amongst all those copy-pasted notions in the columns, the only noticeable difference seemed to be that once again, the team had altered its name. Amidst the thrilling legal dramas between Lotus and Lotus the previous year, Fernandes had popped an alternate option in his back pocket should matters go south, when he purchased sports car manufacturer Caterham in April. By November, both Lotuses thankfully recognised the headache 2 nearly identically named teams was causing and came to an agreement to end such matters. Team Lotus and Group Lotus were finally united under one banner, while Fernandes announced his team would be rebranded into Caterham F1. "We are proud of what we have achieved by bringing the Team Lotus name back to Formula 1, said Asmat. Although we are sad to say goodbye, we are excited about owning our own future and being in control of our own destiny. Now we have no one to be compared to. We make our own history." But from that initial domino of change, several more would start to topple. We've regularly mentioned the performances Kovalainen had been extracting to the tune of boosting a reputation that had taken an enormous knock whilst at McLaren. But on the topic of Trulli, we've been a little more quiet. And that's because for the Italian, driving for Lotus had caused the opposite effect. And the man once renowned for his incredible one-lap pace was now approaching something close to lackluster. In 2010, it had been put down to a lack of motivation given the drop-off in performance from his previous teams, as well as the reliability troubles, to which Jarno lamented how they regularly seemed to centre around only his car. For 2011, he was fired up once more, quoted in an interview stating, "I'm ready for the fight, I really want to get back racing in the midfield." Poor Jarno, though, wouldn't have imagined just how much he would struggle with the T128, and specifically, its power steering system. Gascoigne reflected that Trulli was the most sensory driver I've ever worked with. It's what ultimately gives him that extra couple of tenths. Trouble was that strength was equally his biggest weakness. With the power steering on the Lotus, he simply couldn't feel the car and couldn't drive it to his full potential. For all his qualifying prowess, the Italian was outqualified 16-2 by his teammate and even found himself briefly rested in favour of test driver Karun Chandhok. Despite having his contract renewed for 2012 and even driving the new Caterham in the first pre-season test of the year, most felt the Italian was living on borrowed time. Those feelings only grew stronger when former Renault driver Vitaly Petrov dropped onto the market in early December, and the swap of the two drivers was formally confirmed on the 17th of February. Fernandes insisted the decision was not an easy one, adding, "It was one we made to ensure we give fresh impetus across the whole team and with a realistic eye on the global economic market." In layman's terms, Petrov would hopefully be faster, and if not, brought several bags of rubles for his troubles. It didn't take long for the days since one of the team's starting figures left the project tally to reset to 0. The next day, it was announced that Gascoigne had been promoted from Caterham F1's chief designer to chief technical officer of the entire Caterham group, now tackling roles across not just their motorsport activities but road cars, technology and more. Though he'd occasionally be popping up at race weekends, it would be a step away from the daily affairs of the F1 team he'd been so instrumental in getting off the ground, and that absence would surely be felt. Smith would now take the lead as technical director, now supported by a new recruit in former McLaren and Ferrari chief aerodynamicist John Eiley. All of the above had occurred before the season began, and there would be two other big movements within Caterham as the year progressed. The first was a movement about as literal as you can get, as the team upsticks to the old Arrows base in Leafield, Oxfordshire. Aside from being a simply superior technical facility, it had the unenviable advantage of being located in the promised land of England's motorsport heart, running from Northampton around London and towards Woking in Surrey. Not only were Caterham now just closer to leading motorsport suppliers and facilities, but location-wise it made the project a lot more appealing to entice leading lights from other F1 technical departments without asking them to undergo a massive upheaval. By the start of November, a new team principal would be stepping through those halls. Fernandes announced that he would be stepping away from his owner/team principal juggling act to settle into the role as simply owner. In his stead came a familiar face to those from the Drive to Survive generation, one Cyril Abiteboul. The Frenchman had first entered F1 when he was parachuted into Renault as an executive director, as matters began to unravel post-Crashgate, and his intelligent, hard-nosed and unintimidated personality was recognised by Fernandes through their Caterham-Renault connection. He'd initially joined the project as chief executive officer 2 months prior, and now at 35 would be the youngest team principal on the field. "One day we will earn our seat at the top table of Formula One," said Fernandes, and he is the right person to take us there. There's two ways to view so many changes. One is an attempt to progress through the order by improving your assets and adjusting accordingly. The other is a knee-jerk reaction to the lack of progress that had been made the previous year. That maybe Fernandes thought something had to be done to get things moving. To paraphrase Theodore Roosevelt, the best thing you can do is the right thing, the next best thing is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing. 2012 would famously see one of their more dramatic conclusions to an F1 season, as Sebastian Vettel clawed back in a 44-point deficit to thwart a distraught Fernando Alonso at the season finale. Adding to that excitement were the multiple challengers at the front with 7 different winners from the first 7 races. Caterham were not amongst the 7 constructors to stand on the podium that year, nor the other 2 who finished amongst the points. Yet again, they stood still, and yet again, they were able to decipher why. In short, the move to their new facilities would create a domino effect that would harm the team's development. In the winter, they had moved from their primary wind tunnel at Aerolab to a shared usage with the Williams tunnel, and naturally there were differences comparing the results from one tunnel to the other. As Kovalainen put it, we saw bigger gains in the wind tunnel and in the simulator, then we actually get on track and we can't get the performance to the track. Those issues mainly centred around an issue over developing the exhaust, an area in which performance rewards were high, but with the wind tunnel woes plus a run of rainy practice sessions, meant the final upgrades came too late with too little benefit. With all efforts there, development on other aspects of the car was subsequently neglected. What made it worse though was not just the disappointment over their static nature, but the fact that because they hadn't taken that jump forwards, they oh so nearly took a tumble backwards. For the first time in their existence, Caterham found competition from those they had previously held at a comfortable arm's length, in what was formerly Virgin, now rebranded to Russian sports car manufacturer Marussia. Having finished rock bottom in the constructors for the 2 previous years, they were now in the hunt for Caterham's well-established spot as best of the rest within the newer trio on the block, and a financially lucrative 10th place spot in the Constructors' Championship. With points scoring about as realistic a prospect for the 2 as that United fan cutting his hair, it would all come down to a battle over who could record the highest place race finish to settle that particular tiebreak. The Russians drew first blood at the season opener in Australia, where Timo Glock took 14th, benefiting from the Caterham pair both conking out whilst running ahead. 5 races later, Caterham nipped back in front with a 13th place finish in Monaco, only for Marussia to return the favour several months later in Singapore, when Glock took 12th. So it all came down to the curtain closer in Brazil. Whoever could finish 12th or higher would trump the other. Amongst the chaos and drama that day, Glock had climbed into 11th, well ahead of the Caterhams, only for a safety car to wipe that lead out, and then a certain Jean-Eric Vergne to wipe him out. That left teammate Charles Pic now in an all-important 12th position, with just 9 laps to go, but in hot pursuit from Petrov. 3 laps later, as he moved aside to be lapped by the Ferraris, the Russian took full advantage to squeeze by 2. And when Tina Turner fans simply DeResta crashed out moments later, it became 11th, returning the honour of best race result outright to Caterham headquarters, not to mention that precious 10th place in the constructors. It wasn't lost on F1's finest conspiracy theorists that the driver who Petrov had passed for that vital spot was the same one who had signed for Caterham earlier that very same month, and Mauritius director of engineering Nikolai Fomenko went so far as to suggest there had been some shenanigans involved. Such slanderous suggestions were, of course, swiftly denied from all parties, but it didn't assist the relationship between the two teams, nor the tentative prospect of them joining forces. Whispers on the F1 flavoured grapevine suggested that with both parties still a long way short of what either had hoped for, that mayhap then two might want to pool their resources together for a proper stab at matters. But if the tension for the Pic Petrov particular hadn't closed the door, then the alleged takeover bid from Fernandes did so, one that Mauritius chief executive, now Cadillac team principal Graham Loudon, described as totally unacceptable. Though things had ended in heartbreaking fashion for the Mauritius mob, with team principal John Booth quipping, "Disappointed doesn't even come close," it was hard to argue that it wasn't a fair reflection of the season. Once again, Caterham had been the class of the newer bunch, finishing ahead on 18 out of 20 races. But by now it was reaching a point where that was no longer good enough, and no doubt the near drop behind Mauritius would have only opened Caterham's eyes to just how important it was now to start scoring points, not just for the sake of pride, but survival. Kovalainen reflected on the year by stating, "The fact that we haven't been able to develop the car throughout the season as well as Mauritius is a disappointment. I think we have a better team than them, we have better facilities, we have good people. We should have all the ingredients to do better." Still though, it didn't seem to matter which ingredients were going into the Caterham casserole. The result was turning out the same time and time again. The positivity of the previous years was now starting to slowly dissipate. Doubt creeped in. What if that next step never came, and the gap to the midfield and beyond was just insurmountable? As Bruce Jones quipped in the season preview, if progress in F1 was guaranteed by ambition and dedication, then Fernandes' team would have advanced to the midfield by now. But after a promising start, things had become increasingly static. Though their new team principal was keen to stress early on in 2013, "I want to show we're on a positive trend, we're professional, we're here to stay," others pondered for just how long the man at the top of the tree would want to keep hurling money at the project for a continuation of minimal results. The vulnerable nature of the life of an F1 team was only too prevalent on everyone's minds when it was announced in the off-season that HRT had gone the way of the dodo. The Spaniards had carried the mantle of back-row bothering last-placed losers for the last 3 years. With them gone, there was a vacancy for that role, and unless either of the remaining newbies could now roll up their socks and make that long-awaited leap into the midfield, it would be one of them occupying that 11th and final spot in the constructors' table, the first of the losers. But then there was that old phrase to consider: short-term pain for long-term gain. For a major wrinkle in 2013 would be the fact that it was the last year of one of F1's regulation cycles. The sport would be moving from its V8 to V6 era in 2014, an element that was hotly anticipated to be an expensive output for customer outfits, requiring some creative budget juggling from those further down the order. There'd also been numerous car design changes to assign resources to. The introduction of 8-speed fixed ratio gearboxes, narrower front wings, adjustments to the layout of rear wings, a reduction in nose and chassis height, and an increase to the minimum weight allowed for cars and drivers. The end of another era of regulations prompted that age-old debate across every team. Considering your resources, where do you apply your focus? Do you do a Haas, so to speak, writing off the current year in favour of all effort going into the next year to gain a head start? Or do you go the other way and take advantage of others diverting their attentions to jump ahead in the current pecking order? As Eiley quipped, you could spend a week finding a tiny amount of performance on the current car, or a week finding a huge amount on next year's. Further complicating matters for Caterham was the fact that given their relative size to the bigger fish in the F1-shaped pond, they were limited on their options. A Mercedes or a Red Bull could afford to do both. Caterham simply didn't have the budget or the resources for that. A good long look was taken over how to circumvent such a predicament, with the conclusion being that the best solution would be to acquire even more money from that godsend to all struggling smaller F1 teams, the blessed object known as the pay driver. Previously, the team's strongest assets had arguably been running two experienced, proven drivers who could maximise lap times, performance and development. But out for 2013 went Kovalainen and Petrov, and in came what could only be described, not unfairly, as a pair of middling junior series drivers with arguably bigger paychecks than trophy cabinets. One was the aforementioned Pique, entering his second F1 season, and it wasn't lost to onlookers that the Frenchman came with ties to Renault, following a recent marriage between Caterham Cars and Alpine, Pique's sponsor. Despite being described as 2012's most impressive rookie in the 2013 preview guide, ahead of fellow Frenchman Verne, his first year had been relatively nondescript, not helped of course by uncompetitive machinery. The second was Guido van der Garde, a driver who had hovered on the fringes of F1 since 2006 and had undertaken a number of practice sessions with Caterham in 2012, where the Dutchman had admittedly closed the gap to his experienced stablemates. But his GP2 CV read as fairly unmemorable, and he'd be starting his F1 journey at the tender age of 27, said the 33-year-old YouTuber. Unlike the previous year, and other than the change of drivers and a fresh lick of paint, very little else changed around Caterham heading into 2013, and that included the new CT03, which observers were quick to notice how visibly similar it was to its predecessor. The plan seemed apparent to all: essentially write off this year with little work applied to the car, scoop up the cash flow from their new drivers, and then divert all focus onto 2014, whilst continuing to hold pattern in their seemingly locked-in position of 10th place in the Constructors. In Abitable's words, "We're better equipped than Marussia, so if we're not finishing 10th, we're not doing a good enough job." Take a quick moment to gather your thoughts and consider who didn't do a good enough job in the 2013 F1 season. Is it a team? Are they green? Do they rhyme with Bateram? Full marks to you. Marussia would prove faster out of the gate, and amidst the standard early season reliability hiccups across the field, Caterham's rivals took full advantage to come home 13th at the second round in Malaysia, with Pique over 30 seconds adrift of his fellow Frenchman Jules Bianchi that day. Faced with the very real prospect of not just the ignominy of being bottom of the pile, but the drop in precious prize money that came with it, a hasty U-turn was made on plans to only focus on 2014. F1 is a short-term sport, and we can't afford to serve that excuse forever, said Abitable in China, the race after Malaysia. We'll be developing the car this year. It was quickly noted that their inexperienced driver pairing might not be the best for pointing car development in the right direction, and so assisting on that front would be team alumni Kovalainen, out and in of the Caterham factory faster than a Grandpa Simpson at a burlesque house. Post that hammer blow in Malaysia, it was announced the Finn would be returning as their reserve driver, tackling several Friday practice sessions with what the team called major upgrades. And they were sorely needed. After his first outing in Barren, his initial thoughts on the CT03 were not exactly glowing, labelling it more unbalanced, more inconsistent, more difficult to drive, and echoing what most others had assumed from the moment it had rolled out into pre-season testing, that it was essentially the previous year's car with nothing done to it. Tweaks were made to the side pods, diffuser and both sets of wings. Quickly, Caterham returned to their so-called rightful position above Marussia in the pecking order. From the introduction of the first wave of upgrades in Bahrain, Caterham outqualified Marussia 14-2, including an 11-race run from Sakir to South Korea. The clear highlight within that streak was in Belgium, where a well-timed gamble from Van der Gaard to switch to slicks during an initially wet first qualifying session saw him finish the first segment a staggering third, ultimately qualifying in 14th place, Caterham's best qualifying performance yet. Unfortunately though, whilst the one-lap pace was there, the crucial bit of race day fortune was not. In that same time frame, Caterham took the honours of being the first car home 3/4 of the time, and though both drivers came close to matching that hallowed 13th place from Bianchi, with each recording a 14th place finish of their own, neither received the bang of a leading engine or the blare of a lucky safety car to take them any higher. So it was that Caterham, from the heights of being best of the rest, via the ongoing enthusiastic insistence of making a step into the midfield, had now finished rock bottom. Still, this might well have just been a bump in the road, a confirmation that to go forwards, sometimes you have to go backwards, or from a developmental perspective, just stand still. That was certainly the viewpoint of Debutants. We didn't develop much the car this season. Next season will be a totally different ballgame. And it really needed to be. Caterham needed to call the captain because this was a crunch year. They and Marussia had comfortably trumped the Ram team of the mid-80s for most races without a point. It was a far cry from those initial dreams of 2010. Cast your minds back and you recall that a 5-year plan had been outlined for the project. Under that model, it had been hoped that the team would be in a position to be winning races in 2014. That was beyond even a laughable notion by this point of time, least of all for Fernandes, who was about to undergo a serious sense of humour failure. The promises of being poised to take that next step were still unfulfilled, and the Malaysian's patience had finally worn thin. On the 21st of January, to the 250 factory workers he had gathered at the facility, Fernandes declared, "This is it, the final chance. We've given you the best infrastructure, the best potential drivers. It's now down to all of you to go and do it." He would go on to state, "If we're at the back, I don't think I'm going to carry on. Nothing is set in stone, but after 5 years with no points, there is a limit to one's patience, money, and motivation. I need to feel like we're going somewhere. In the simplest terms, if we continue to be shit, I'm going to quit." With that wonderfully welcoming atmosphere in place, it was bizarrely also announced that same day that the team had signed 2 new drivers to once again hammer home the point that this year would be yet another fresh start, and one supplemented by drivers with budgets. One was the dictionary definition of the middling GP2 driver, somehow turned F1 driver of the era, Sweden's Marcus Ericsson, at the start of a journey that would somewhat inexplicably culminate in a future Indy 500 win. More interest was applied to his new stablemate Kamui Kobayashi. The Japanese driver had dazzled F1 fans with his banzai overtaking style across 61 previous Grand Prix, and when it emerged that he was losing his F1 drive at the end of 2012, fans had rallied to conjure up a sponsorship bundle to keep him on the grid. Unsuccessful then, it was coming in handy now, as Kamui turned down a paid role with Ferrari GT Racing to return to F1, essentially racing for free. Though the pair might have felt like they had inadvertently stumbled into a community meme, there was still a sense of belief that things would be more than okay. Kobayashi declared that this was a great opportunity for his and Ericsson's lack of recent F1 knowledge to pay dividends, owing to the rule changes making a lack of experience less of a disadvantage. And on the topic of Fernandes' ultimatum, he stated, "If there is pressure, it can only be a positive thing." Couple that with the hopes that the effort put into developing the 2014 car in preference to the 2013 would pay dividends, and that another touted though ultimately dropped $200 million budget cap would provide some assistance. Suffice to say, all such optimism went out the window when the new car was unveiled. The kindest words in the media described the new front nose array as interesting and striking, which were quite far removed from the reactions given by those of us who recall seeing it unveiled and fearing just what the remainder of the 2014 cars would look like. Matters didn't get much better when the car rolled out on track. Though it ran reliably, which was more than any other Renault-powered machine could boast, there were still some underlying performance issues. Kobayashi was heard to be of the opinion that he might be more competitive at the opening rounds in a GP2 car, Ironically, those words would come back to haunt him when Caterham's junior outfit lapped faster than the senior operation at the 2014 Barcelona race weekend, though this was as much due to the F1 regulations slowing down cars as much as it being another Caterham calamity. Despite Debutants's claims that we believe we have answered the challenges presented by the new regulations as effectively as we can, and an initial flicker of hope when Kobayashi advanced into Q2 in Australia, thanks to some woes from their old pals at Lotus, it was clear that once again, a step forward hadn't been taken. If anything, matters had gone backwards, as was highlighted by journalist Peter Windsor in his mid-season report when deciphering the struggles that the drivers were dealing with. Windsor noted how just listening to Ericsson's downshifts into corners showcased the car's total lack of stability. He's so unsure of what the back end is going to do that he frequently selects a lower gear than necessary just to keep it in line. Things weren't looking terribly bright by the time the Monaco Grand Prix arrived, which would prove equal parts promising and disastrous for Caterham. Donning your finest rose-tinted glasses, you would witness that it had been the team's best weekend yet, equalling their highest ever finish, as Ericsson came home in 11th, a little over 10 seconds down the road from the final points-paying position. Kobayashi, meanwhile, was telling anyone who'd listen that but for a forceful pass from Bianchi on him, he was sure he had finished in the points. But he didn't, and the one who did was Monsieur Bianchi. At the 83rd time of asking, one of 2010's new teams had finally scored points, and Caterham's gut was suitably punched. For it had been an opportunity fairly seized in a chaotic race, but rarely do such opportunities come round twice within 1 year. Barring a minor miracle, Caterham would now be locked into consecutive wooden spoon honours. That, if anything, seemed the dictionary definition of matters not improving, and fresh attention turned to Fernandes. Was now the time he'd try and wash his hands of all this? Media outlets declared a £350 million asking price had been established, and that an information memorandum was now circulating about in the Middle East, which Fernandes vehemently denied, stating simply, "Caterham is not for sale." So anyway, on the 2nd of July, Caterham was sold. The last words Fernandes had to say on the matter were simply, "F1 hasn't worked." But there's plenty of time for more of his opinions on the matter once we reach the conclusion. For now, thanks to the change of ownership, Caterham employees were grateful that they would still be working. Eiley admitted at year's end that had new owners not arrived at this moment, the team would have been unable to continue beyond the forthcoming British Grand Prix. That's not to say there wasn't still a large degree of uncertainty over the team, namely who the hell the new owners were or their plans. The press release merely described them as a consortium of Swiss and Middle Eastern investors. Paddock whispers suggested that not only did no such group exist, but the whole thing was merely a front for F1 boss Bernie Ecclestone, who had stepped in to buy the team in an effort to save face. That was later debunked when the consortium was unmasked as the thrillingly corporate-sounding Engervest, who had hidden their identities at the behest of the team's new advisor. But more on him in a second. Not assisting that air of unease was the fact that as part of the takeover, Debutants had been shown the door, and in his stead came former F1 driver Christian Albers. The Dutchman had wholly failed to show much in the way of being successful in F1 from his exploits in the cockpit, let alone from the pit wall, from which his experience was entirely non-existent. Perhaps tellingly, Albers would last just 9 weeks in his new role before stepping aside in favour of his former assistant, Manfredi Revetto. Perhaps the only logical addition was the presence of the aforementioned new advisor, Colin Colles. Across the past 10 years, the Romanian had been on line one of every team in crisis, to bust in, take matters by the scruff of the neck and get things sorted. When Jordan jumbled their way through a litany of new owners in the late 2000s, Colles had been there to steer the Silverstone ship. He had taken over the hot mess that was HRT just 3 weeks before the start of the 2010 season, a team that, quote, didn't even have a screwdriver, and got some cars hastily assembled to roll onto the grid in Bahrain. As he put it so succinctly, you have to imagine this team is like a clinically dead patient. We are the intensive care specialists trying to revitalise it. It was not a pretty process. Costs were cut, jobs were lost, bills were paid, deals were discussed and debated, such as talks with Red Bull over the prospect of placing a young Carlos Sainz in the car for the remainder of the year. Endurance racing superstar Andre Lotterer did sit in the car for one of F1's oddest one-off appearances that lasted a whole lap and a half, though would have seen more action had Caterham not asked their new rookie to step aside during future free practice appearances so that another rookie, future Manor driver Roberto Merri, could get some playtime. The German sensibly declined the offer. Despite all the chaos, the lofty goal of moving Caterham off the bottom of the constructors' table was set. Though it seemed incredibly unlikely as Collers quipped, you never know, you can have a lucky punch even with a slow car. It was certainly true that the unthinkable had regularly occurred to those outfits Collers had aligned himself with. Jordan had taken a podium at the 2005 US Grand Prix. Spiker had led at the Nürburgring in 2007, and Force India had come oh so close to a sensational fourth in Monaco 2008, until Kimi Räikkönen had something to say on the matter. There was no reason it couldn't happen again. Long-awaited updates were now finally coming onto the car from Spa onwards, with the most striking being some very overdue rhinoplasty. Progress and pace swiftly followed. Caterham had failed to finish ahead of Marussia in their own private little soiree at the back since the second round of the year, but post-upgrades had now come out on top in every race since. At its previous worst, the car had dawdled to being around 5 seconds off the pace. By Russia, Ericsson's qualifying effort saw him just a tenth shy of making it into Q2. That, though, was a rare positive that weekend, as Kobayashi retired on lap 33 with a suspension issue, and it was later revealed by Kamui that the team had sent him out to race with a broken suspension, well aware it was damaged, and sought to repair the issue by wrapping it in carbon. It might well have been Caterham's final flourish, as when the Grand Prix circus rolled into the United States, glaringly, Caterham did not. On the 20th of October, Caterham Sports Limited, the manufacturer who built the racing cars for the F1 team, went into administration. Mudslinging began in earnest between the team's past and present owners over who might accept responsibility. Engevest were threatening legal action against Fernandes for not transferring shares to the new owners, and subsequently suggesting they might just quit altogether. The Malaysian retorted, stating this was garbage, and that if you buy something you should pay for it, alluding to a dispute over whether the new owners had paid for the team or fulfilled any obligations or guarantees concluded within the deal. As barbs and insults flew back across the newspaper pages, the Caterham factory was quietly locked up in the background until matters were sorted. Unable to access their cars, Caterham received permission to miss both the US and Brazilian rounds in the hopes of securing a buyer for the project in that time. It was increasingly looking, as the great Edmund Blackadder once put it, the stickiest situation since Sticky the stick insect got stuck on a sticky bun. Matters became so desperate that, with Administrator Finbar O'Connell having taken control of the operation, a crowdfunding scheme was unveiled on the Friday before Brazil in an effort to raise the £2.35 million required to make it to the final race in Abu Dhabi. Rewards from baseball caps and front wings to a 3-day trip to the season finale were all on offer. There was exciting for fans. The image of a beleaguered team limping along cap in hand stood in stark contrast to the high-performance professional backdrop that F1 liked to paint itself as, with a disgruntled Eccleston describing the whole business a disaster for the sport. Against all the odds, and despite failing to reach their intended target by approximately £500,000, a cobbled-together Caterham did reappear in Abu Dhabi. A variety of sponsors clubbed together to fill that financial gap, whose pedigree ranged from tech security and an FX firm to the Windmill Inn pub from the tiny English village of Littleworth. Though there also seemed little worth in doing so, a number of the old Caterham crowd rejoined for the finale. Still redundant employees were signed up as contractors, and whilst Ericsson had opted out of a return, Kobayashi agreed to drive, and was joined by debutant Will Stevens, who had stumped up £500,000 worth of cash for a one-off outing. It was all more heartwarming than anything on track. The two lapped 4 seconds off the pace in qualifying, circulating at the back of the pack for much of the race before Kobayashi retired, and Stevens trundled home in last place. The question now was whether this effort had been able to attract any new owners. Rumours aplenty flew about potential buyers, mostly from those within pre-existing F1 circles. Renault, who had previously scaled back from a full works outfit to a simple engine supplier, were allegedly angling for a return, and in Caterham, they had an outfit with an existing Renault contract. O'Connell even flew to the post-season World Motorsport Council in Geneva to convince the other team principals for their assistance, seeking tips for anyone in the market for an F1 team, or if any of them fancied reshaping Caterham into their own junior outfit, a la a Red Bull and Toro Rosso situation. But it was all to no avail. On Monday, the 9th of March 2015, the new F1 season would burst into life in Australia. And on the other side of the world, at the Leafield Technical Centre of Oxfordshire, the remnants of what had once been such promising potential were snaffled up through auction. The final chapters of Caterham F1 were officially closed. More than a decade on, there is still a faint hope that the Caterham name might return once more. In August 2025, reports surfaced that Kuwaiti entrepreneur Saad Kassis Mohammed was gearing up plans to enter F1 in 2027 with a rebirth of the Caterham project. Supposedly, a technical centre has already been established in Silverstone, and discussions are underway with two of F1's current engine suppliers for a multi-year technical partnership, with the 24-year-old Kassis Mohammed having already marked €280 million for the project. It feels about as likely as finding someone who thinks the CT05 was a good-looking car, but you never know. Knowing my luck, their entry will be accepted the day after I finish recording. If you were to ask my initial thoughts on this topic, I would tell you that to the left-hand side of the words that I'm typing now, I have open a near 50-page document of notes, quotes, and observations on Caterham nee Lotus. And my gut reaction to having sifted through all of that is that I need a stiff drink. But if I was to satiate that thirst, then all I would need to do is to take a shot every time I've read a phrase that follows the lines of poised to move forward. I think if I do that, then this litre bottle of gin quickly becomes a litre bottle of nothing. Year after year, that was the tagline, whether by a belief that the gap to the midfield had finally been overcome, or by a threat that if it didn't, then it would all be over. Frustratingly, that is all the Caterham conundrum might be remembered for, a whole lot of promises over potential that evaporated into disappointment before demise. So, as always, we turn to our favourite letter in the alphabet, Y. Specifically, why was this the case? What was it that stopped this project from moving forward into the midfield at the points that seem such a logical next step, never mind thoughts of wins or returning the Lotus name to its old glory days? Not just the technical issues that blighted each year, but there's something that scuppered the team as a whole. Well, who better to ask of their opinion than the principal actors within the whole show? Here's an excerpt from an interview with Trulli in November 2013. It's difficult to talk about Lotus. It was a big mistake. Nothing that was proposed before we entered the season happened. When it is a mission impossible for everyone, even an experienced driver cannot help in this situation. When you don't have the resources to turn things around, you will never get on top. It doesn't take a genius to recognise what he's inferring to. The budget cap, that promised land that could have allowed these new teams to have entered closer to, if not within, the midfield from the get-go, yet never came to be. Fernandes talked a good talk about how its absence wouldn't be a hindrance in the long run back in 2010, how with thrifty spending with the right people and the right assets, competitiveness could be achieved on the cheap, citing an estimation of around £55 million to have a semi-decent operation up and running. But it sounds naive and ill-informed when you consider that other Lotus's Gerard Lopez is quoted as saying that costs then had reached a point where you needed a minimum of £70 million to enter F1 just to turn up with the most absolute bare bones basic car, never mind the extra expenditure on making it better. And both ballpark figures were light years away from something like the modern day budget cap, 12 years on from Caterham's demise, upwards of £165 million. For the quartet who had entered on the promise of a budget cap nearly £140 million cheaper than that, it was always an impossible mountain to climb. As Fernandes reflects, I was promised by Mosley that the sport was going to halve the costs, that everyone would get a fair shot, but in fact that never happened and the costs just kept going up. It meant hands would have to be thrust into pockets to cover that financial gap, and to the credit of Fernandes and his partners, they did exactly that, to have a damn good go at making F1 work. Compared to the rest of the new influx, their upgrade list was always substantially more impressive. Renault engines, Red Bull gearboxes, an ever-growing technical department relocating to a new technical centre, better windmill facilities, a junior programme and stairway. Even though Kovalainen has openly admitted he stayed too loyal to the team, he still reflects, "I really believed that the team could make the steps." Yet it almost beggars belief how Caterham gathered up all of that and yet 5 years failed to provide even a single point for their troubles. Here perhaps is another issue. On one hand, this attitude of throwing everything bar the kitchen sink speaks to the team's lofty ambitions, but on the other it speaks of impatience, of wanting to run before they could walk, of ambition fueled by a touch of ego. It's easy to see where the ego comes from, because what Lotus did on that 2010 debut, return, whatever you want to call it, was very impressive. To turn up with such late notice and perform to the standard they did. It was doubly so to do so as best of the rest against competition with substantially more time. But the majority of that so-called competition was in shambles. One who never made it, one who barely did, and the remainder which, sure, had some decent components to it, but did not operate anywhere near peak capacity for the first few years. Like we've said, remove those other teams from the equation, and the first year abruptly turns from awesome to atrocious. But because they had looked so impressive and came with the ambition and upgrades to match, it was only logical to foresee the next step for them. With ample preparation moving forward, surely things would only get better. And then it didn't. Because all of a sudden came the sobering reminder that this is Formula One. A place where dreams grow larger but results rarely match that same trajectory. A sport where knocking seconds off your lap times is a fairly easy process, and one where whittling off the tenths is exceedingly difficult. Whilst you are dreaming, so is everyone else, and whilst you are improving, so is everyone else, and with substantially more in terms of budgets and facilities to do so. Thus, the Caterhams found themselves stuck in that holding pattern, the status quo never changing, never able to change, and the only thing to really head in an upward direction was frustration levels, as results continually failed to meet expectations. In a way, you can sympathise with Fernandes' breaking point at the start of 2014. After 5 years, there's a limit to one's patience, money, motivation, a need to feel like we're going somewhere. There are distinctly mixed messages when it comes to reflection on the man at the top of the tree. Gascoigne, a man who has worked underneath names like Ken Tyrrell and Eddie Jordan, let's not forget, calls Tony Fernandes an inspirational leader and probably the best I've ever worked for, citing not just that willingness to invest, but how even from the start, the Malaysian hung on to the project even amidst its initial uncertainty. Others with less of a connection to the man view things differently. Colles has this to say on his predecessor's efforts. There was no clear structure, no control. A lot of the people there didn't know how to run a small team. With all respect to Tony Fernandes, he is a successful businessman, but he didn't know how to run a small F1 team. A lot of it was driven by ego. Personally, I don't know if it's just that. Yes, there was an inflated sense of ego based on what they had initially achieved. The choices and decisions made for the sake of improvement were in part rushed, chasing progress over stability in a desperation to be successful. But this was not primarily done with the expectation that F1 would come easy, like the fat cats of Ford or tyrants of Toyota might have thought. There's something else in there. To me, it feels like this project was rushed along because of a genuine passion for motorsport that matched those we discussed way back at the beginning, those that raced for the love of racing. I was on the grid with some of the greatest brands, and for me, life isn't just about success, it's about doing things you believe in, says Fernandes. There's Ferrari, McLaren and Frank Williams, my hero. I was on the same grid. Right at the back, but I was on the same grid. Maybe that same starry-eyed approach was why Fernandes tried to fast-forward Formula One. The heart overruled the head, and passion is no replacement for doing things the correct way. If the biggest reason that Caterham failed was the pulled rug effect from the drop budget cap, then their biggest flaw was trying to succeed in the manner that they did. For daring to dream so big in an atmosphere where such things are so regularly and ruthlessly crushed. The FIA, the Formula One group, even F1 as a whole, is hesitant to welcome in new teams, and there will always be suggestions that it comes down to money, as it always does, and a refusal for anyone to share from the enormous honeypot. But maybe it's also to save any prospective team from themselves. I started watching F1 when I was at school, recalls Fernandes. Eddie Jordan could come in and form a team, and that year or the year after, he could win a race. That will never happen anymore. Above all, the tale of Lotus, Caterham should act as a cautionary measure for those thinking of dipping their toes into the big ocean of Formula One, to remind them that it's called the Piranha Club for a reason.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.